The topic of my lunchtime lecture today deals with one of the issues I've been interested in a very long time, at least since the 1980s, which is the creative uses of stereoscopic 3D technology. And this hopefully relatively short presentation is based on a keynote lecture I recently gave at the Carnegie Mellon University at an event named Art and Code as the arts keynote. And so what I'm planning to do in this lecture is first to give you a very brief idea about some essential aspect of stereoscopic 3D, and then jump right away to those ways that artists have shown interest and sort of like contributed to that form of technology. And those examples I'll be discussing stretch about 100 years from the beginning of the 20th century, pretty close to the present. So please bear with me. And I would like to begin, however, this talk by taking you back to the late 1960s and introducing you an art student. This is Marion Shroud. Marion Shroud, who's engaged in the activity of viewing one of the most sensational and, should we say, notorious works of art that had just been unveiled for the public at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And so what Marion would have seen by peeking into those holes in the central part of this old wooden door is this scene. Scene that Marcel Duchamp, the artist, had been working on secretly for about 20 years, and which he meant as his legacy, which was to be unveiled only after his death. A work which, strictly speaking, is not about stereoscopy, although it is definitely about three-dimensional representation. Work that the instructions that Duchamp provided for the museum would look something like this if there ever was a way of looking at from some other angle, so to say, in a way, creep behind that door that forms the interface for viewing this work. And this is how Jean-François Lyotard diagrammatically explained that particular work. So we do have an actual three-dimensional composition, a kind of an installation that is supposed to be seen from a strictly defined position. A work that could be interpreted in many different ways, but that surely has to do with the art of museum dioramas, so three-dimensional illusionistic scenes, as well as it has to do with, as I claim, the idea about stereoscopic vision. But this is one aspect with which it seems to be breaking. So this is, of course, Albrecht Dürer's famous diagrammatic representation of the art of the Renaissance perspective. So the art of taking three-dimensional objects and by using mathematical transformation rules, sort of like transforming them on a two-dimensional surface. It probably has much more to do with scenes like this, which is an imaginary scene from the late 18th century showing a lady inside a so-called boîte d'optique or peep show box, which was a typical popular media of the time and also inspired the imagination. It also probably could have something to do with works by Hans Bellmer, his famous dummy or puppet compositions like this one, La Poupée from 1938. But so to return to the interface, which is this famous wooden door, I just need to point out a tiny little detail which I think bears great significance, and I will just point out for you that detail right now. So right in the middle, except using this door as a so-called ready-made, there are two little tiny drilled holes through which the light shines through, and holes that basically point out for the viewer a point of interest inside. And I think that it is highly significant in this case that we don't deal with just one hole, so like hole for the one eye, but we deal with a pair of holes. For if you know the work of Marcel Duchamp and its intense self-referentiality that basically covers most of his long career, we could easily make a leap from one of his last works, so Étant donné, to one of his early radical works. This piece, which is a so-called rectified, ready-made, known as handmade stereoptic on slide or hand stereoscopy, that Duchamp created still as a young man while he was staying during the First World War in Buenos Aires. Now, this work is ready-made in the sense that it is based on a found image that, according to a story, Duchamp found on some street stall or flea market, and which he then modified himself. And the modification in this case was just basically adding a three-dimensional stereoscopic drawing on top of that photographic image, which was on the original sort of like popular 3D slide that anybody could buy and use and look at with those little viewers that I'll demonstrate you in a moment. So basically, I believe what Duchamp was interested in this particular thing was in his typical way, the kind of paradox of having a stereoscopic photograph which basically has no effect of relief whatsoever. So 3D photograph, which is basically pretty flat even if you look at it through the stereoscope. So there's a kind of like a ultimate disappointment or ultimate failure or elements that Duchamp very often used as in his work as an artist. And then this handmade addition of that three-dimensional relief-like illusion in that basically flat picture plane. So using hand drawing, which we very often associate with doing something on two-dimensional surfaces and basically just appealing to basically so-called one-eyed vision, but using it as a vehicle for stereoscopy in this particular piece. And I will come back to that piece in a moment. Now, if we think about Duchamp's very last documented work, it is this modest-looking drawing, which is known as the Anaglyphic Chimney, 1968, where basically Duchamp, using something that he'd been interested for a very long time, which is this book right here called Les Anaglyphes géométriques, that he bought originally in 1930s. And then it's a kind of a classic of anaglyphic stereoscopic visualization, and which he bought again just before his death, which is this copy you see in this picture, and those pairs of like red and green colored anaglyphic glasses he used to basically visualize this chimney in as a 3D drawing. So we see the amazing extent of his interest in stereoscopy and how that runs through basically across whole of his work, all these decades. So, using Duchamp just here as an example, I think we definitely should ask a couple of well-known questions, which is this fascination with stereoscopic 3D, which I think most people see as a sort of like linked more with popular culture than it seems than with the culture of the arts or the even experimental or avant-garde art. So, what is it that turns this thing into a fad and so that it seems to be happening as kind of waves over and over again? So there are those who think that it happens within sort of like 20-year intervals, like we have seen this thing happening recently if we think about all the Hollywood movies, and it looks like it may be fading, that 3D wave, but we had something exactly around 1990 in the form of virtual reality and books like random dot stereogram books like Magic Eye and things like that. We had another wave in around 1970 with things like Paul Morisset's Frankenstein 3D and a couple of soft pornographic 3D movies and other stuff. And then of course we had the big interest around 1950, things like that. So I'm not going to go into that topic here. But surely it is about something that has to do with this sort of like illusionary bridging between reality and representation that doesn't necessarily happen in all form of visual representation. There's some fantasy in this idea that we can either kind of penetrate these representations or the other way around, the representations sort of like jump at us. And I think that if we look at this poster for the Technicolor film Sangaree, so the positioning of the indexical sign 3 dimension is highly significant here, and that is exactly the sort of like selling point that many 3D movies used. And perhaps we should also think about this poster for the House of Wax in the same manner. And then there's this idea, potentiality of being eaten by Rottweilers at that point, and these days by pit bulls, but not really, rather virtually, which I guess is part of that whole interest. But so this is definitely not the full story, and so the story that I'm trying to tell you as an addition to that popular 3D story is a different one, and I think that it is often, interestingly, a distorted and even an inverted story, as we will soon see. But before I get to that point, so I briefly need to go back to the year 1838, so much further back in time. For that is the year when the British scientist, whose picture you will see in the next slide, demonstrated a discovery that forms, as far as we know, the basis of this idea about stereopsis as a scientifically proven and proven fact. Now, there had been ideas before. Even Leonardo da Vinci, in his famous notebooks, refers to the idea that the picture that our left and our right eye is slightly different. And so this phenomenon was known, but it wasn't really pulled together within a scientific context until 1838. And the context in this case was the idea about the physiology of perception, research that was very lively in the first early decades of the 19th century. And this is the scientist in question, Charles Wheatstone, who was also linked with many other inventions, including the early history of electric telegraphy and other things. And the device that you see here connected with his face is the original stereoscope. So the device with which Charles Wheatstone demonstrated that principle in scientific circles in England. And it didn't happen exactly the way it seems seems to be depicted in this photograph from the Science Museum in London, where this device is still kept. For Charles Wheatstone didn't use photographs. He used drawings in this demonstration. And the reason why that didn't happen was simply that photography hadn't been publicly announced yet. So there were methods that were developed in different countries, including France and England at the time, but that was not a public form of public knowledge. And so Charles Wheatstone demonstrated this by stereoscopic drawings, and that is a highly significant issue, as we will see quite soon. So what's really interesting about this original mirror stereoscope, is its structure as an apparatus. So these pictures that represent the sort of like binocular vision of the human, so which means pictures that have been shot or prepared from slightly different angle, so angles that sort of like try to simulate the parallax difference between our left and right eye. So these pictures are placed on the sides, and it is through this prismatic mirror in the center that the viewer is supposed to sort of like experience that stereoscopic vision. So the important thing here is that basically the person sees both the ingredients, so the ingredients of that experience and the experience itself. So nothing is hidden or undercover. And that basically, of course, demonstrates the scientific nature of that origin of stereoscopic vision. So this is a scientific demonstration device where there's no need or no use for optical illusions like the ones that we encountered in that popular tradition, like represented by those pictures that I just showed you. So until then, as I already quickly referred to, so the mainstream of imaging was rather from 3D to 2D. So the whole system of Renaissance perspective that's probably best been analyzed by Martin Kemp in his magnificent great book, The Science of Art, was a system for producing pictures for one eye. So this means that if we, for example, happen to lose one eye and wanted to go to a museum like Louvre to look at classical works of art, so works from the time of the Renaissance or Baroque or whatever, we would see them basically just as well as anybody with two eyes. So it is basically a way of reducing the three-dimensionality of the world to a two-dimensional plane, and still plane in such a way that the two-dimensional plane references that world through a certain kind of mathematical grid-like system. So this is something different from what stereoscopy tries to do, in the sense that here we have a system which is genuinely meant for two eyes, for the left and the right eye. So a system which tries to sort of like produce a relief-like three-dimensional illusion of reality. And so if we just looked at these things with one eye, so it just simply wouldn't work. And so I mentioned already that this was demonstrated by drawings, something like this is from my collection. It's a very early stereoscopic card from Jules Dubosc, the famous optical instrument maker and inventor from Paris, where basically you can actually see this in 3D if you manage to do what's often known as free viewing. So I'm not going to try to give you a course in free viewing, but this is basically simply an act of doing the same thing with your eyes that you could possibly do with a stereoscope. So this kind of device that I will show you soon, the Victorian Stereoscope, is basically just an optical aid for your eyes. So, but you can actually achieve the same effect with your eyes as well. So by twisting them so that these pictures start moving left and right, so closer to each other, and then you end up having like a three pictures side by side, but the one in the middle shows in this deep three-dimensional illusion. It can be done with this. I can do it. I'm so practiced that I can do it in a second. So and it doesn't destroy your eyes as some people fear. So, but anyway. So what is interesting in the history of stereoscopy is that it became a commercial success and so like mass market item when the structure of the stereoscope was changed, and this happened at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, when another scientist, a Scottish David Brewster, introduced this radically different way of conceiving the stereoscope, which is the so-called lenticular model, where you have actually two lens tubes that sort of like help the eyes, and the picture is placed inside a viewer device. So something like this device. So this has a mirror for reflecting the light inside, and the picture is invisible unless you peek inside the device. This is a Brewster stereoscope. You can pass it around. Don't drop it because it's original. The original glass slide inside. So, and so something about that, and this is of course the way how the pictures were produced. In the earliest times, it was produced by a camera on the left. So because the photography, when this became a mass market item, so the photography became associated with stereoscopy. So the camera slides left and right, and so the positions are marked on the slide. So you actually have to take these left and right eye views successively, and because the early exposure times were so long, you get these ghostly images very often. So where you see that actually the living targets in the stereoscopic picture have moved. So if you find some really early looking stereo views from a flea market, and they see show this kind of ghostly effect where the pictures are not exactly identical, that usually is a sign that that's a picture from the 1850s or early 60s. So later this was eliminated by these special kind of cameras which already has these lens tubes for left and right eye vision. So this led to a huge what we know as stereoscomania. So the dimensions of this stereoscopic boom of the Victorian age are amazing. So it reached really huge dimensions quickly, and I think that we can definitely say that this is the original media machine for the home, because the parlor became the main place. But it's also interesting that the model which really made the absolute breakthrough, so also in the downwards and the social scale, so like leading to the fact that many immigrant and working class families by the end of the 19th century also had their own stereoscopes and viewers, was the so-called Holmes-Bates viewer that you see on the right. So this is the Brewster viewer. This is the prototype for the Holmes viewer, and the one which became the success is on the right, either a pedestal model or handheld model. And that device, in a certain way, is a bit of a synthesis of these original two models, because the picture is visible when you lift your eyes like this, and it only becomes sort of like hidden when you place your eyes in the viewing hood. So I think it has something to do with the practical qualities of this device that actually explains why this became the success story. Also, people could join socially in the selection of these cards and looking at them while one of them was actually immersed. So there's no absolute distinction between this kind of a solitary immersive experience and a certain kind of social experience of a family circle using this very often. Okay. And so this is a typical scene. So there was a large amount of self-reflective Victorian stereo cards, which tried to sort of like position ideologically that device within the Victorian parlor. So you see, so it became a kind of a competitor for the piano playing, which was a typical Victorian pastime, part of the Victorian ideology. Because if you look deep into the back of this stereo card, you see a group of people around the table viewing at these views, stereoscopic views with a stereoscope. So there are two different kinds of activities taking place in the Victorian parlor. And this idea about virtual traveling with these pictures was sort of like a new addition to these traditional forms like piano playing. And that, of course, continued to the 20th century and was kind of reinvented again in the form of Viewmaster reels or stereo realist cameras or that kind of devices. And there was, of course, also the stereoscopic pornography that became a huge market early on, from 1850s onward. Paris was one of the main production centers. There would be much to say about that, and frankly, I would have had much more osé pictures to put here, but I decided to be nice and kind of pretty tame. Okay, there are also other really interesting variations that show up pretty early, and one of them you can see in this card, which is French, 1861, called The Gardener. And what's interesting about this stereo view is that it has a kind of a double role. So if you focus just in a 3D, if you focus on the physical setting of the garden and the buildings at the glass house at the back, you see these pictures in a normal three-dimensional, stereoscopic three-dimensional form. But if you look at the figure on the front, you see that the figure is shown in two poses that are close to each other but not identical. So the idea is that with this kind of stereoscopic card, you would be basically twitching your eyes, alternately closing and opening your eyes and creating a very sort of like simple animation. So here we see an early effort of linking three-dimensionality with moving pictures, which is only, of course, only happens within a sort of like within two phases. But this is an idea that was picked up by many medical researchers who saw stereoscopy as a way of eye training. So technology for helping people to sort of like fight certain kind of defects of the eyes. It was also picked up for many other purposes, such as military uses. And I'm always fascinated by this particular example, because most of us who know the Viewmaster know it from our childhoods and sort of like linked with Disney figures and things like that. But that device was invented 1939, just before when the Second World War was starting. It was actually a way of finding a new way for the new Kodachrome 16mm moving picture film that was actually used then in these picture reels for stereoscopic purposes. And this technology survived the Second World War by being sponsored by the US Armed Forces, so Navy and the US Air Force, also the land forces. So a huge number of training reels were created, and some of them were about identifying enemy ships, even one's own ships or airplanes. And there were also reels that tried to sort of like help fighter planes or machine gunners on bomber planes to sort of like learn the sort of like estimating the distance to the moving target. Okay, and so if we think about this idea of the scientific uses or medical or optical uses of stereoscopy, so we get to this kind of pictures like you see right here. This is part of a series which is well-known early 20th century series called Dr. Wells's Selection of Stereoscopic Charts, where the idea is that basically that putting this device, which is not at all, doesn't look like a stereoscopic view at all. So you put it in the stereoscope, and when you start to like twitching your eyes, you actually see that bird, you have a way of making that bird end up inside that cage and out again. So it's a training device that uses the combination of moving picture and the certain principles of this two-eye view in interesting forms. And this principle is known as the retinal rivalry. So using these similar images. Now this provides me a sort of like bridge finally to the field of the arts. For if we look at this painting by René Magritte, the surrealist, which some of you may have seen, CL, it is not immediately obvious probably for all viewers how this piece could be seen. But basically what Magritte seems to be doing here is taking his inspiration from those popular medical practices using stereoscopic imagery. And so what he's asking the viewer to do is something similar that we see in this Dr. Wells's card. So this means that when you stand in front of this Magritte painting, so you're supposed to pay attention to the fact that by twitching your eyes, you can actually make the word ciel, which means sky, actually travel into this other field. So the word actually appears within that painting. So it is a way of playing with this certain kind of idea about retinal rivalry, and naturally, of course, there is a way of seeing as it is. But I basically believe that Magritte, like many of these other surrealists and other artists, were looking at popular scientific theories and ideas, and that's basically how that thing works. And this provides me a way of coming back for a little while to Marcel Duchamp, with whose work we started this lecture. Now, Duchamp, for me, Duchamp probably is the most important and interesting 20th century artist, if that there's a way of putting it this way. And so if you know a little bit of Duchamp's work, so you know that one of his interests was sort of like playing role-playing games with his art practice. So he created certain kind of semi-fictional alter egos whose careers mixed up with his own career. And this ended up, for example, mixed signings of his artworks, or even signing by the name of his alter egos. So the most famous of them is Rose C'est la Vie, his female alter ego, that many of you surely know from photographs taken by Man Ray, Duchamp's friend. But Duchamp had another less known alter ego that is known as the precision oculist. And precision oculist in this case is basically some kind of a semi-imaginary optical scientist or optician who deals with these optical illusions and optical illusion devices as part of his art practice. And this idea seems to have started to form itself early on in the teens. The time when Duchamp sent this eye doctor's chart from Argentina to Walter Arensberg, who was one of his early supporters, people who saw the value of his work and started collecting those things. And so this idea of basically purchasing an actual eye doctor's chart and using it as a ready-made and even sending it to that main collector of his works was a sort of like an indicator about the birth of the precision oculist, his optician alter ego. So if we then look at this work that we already saw, the handmade stereopticon slide again, we can actually look at it from a slightly different angle. And this is just two of the sort of like stereoscopic cards that come together with one of these famous books about so like stereoscopic optics and vision, and which is called the plastic seeing, Das plastische Sehen, published in 1892. So we basically see that these ingredients that Duchamp used in his ready-made are already something that you can find from this kind of like a semi-didactic books about stereoscopic vision. And so, except that, as I pointed out here, I think the funny part, or even the Dadaist part of it all, is that while in this picture of the seaside, we actually have pretty kind of good stereoscopic cues within the picture plane, which sort of like helps us to create in our brains this idea about the three-dimensional space. So in Duchamp's case, that wasn't. So it was only Duchamp who added this kind of rhomboid form that also harked back to the origins of stereoscopy. So before photography was associated with that idea, that I think we see as the elements of that piece. Duchamp made many other pieces at that time that, for example, this piece, which has this really interesting title, which is also a study for his probably his most famous work, The Large Glass, which is titled "To be Looked at from the Other Side of the Glass with One Eye Closed to for Almost an Hour." So this was done at around the same time when he created this stereoscopic slide piece. And in this case, he's playing with the idea about one eye vision by asking the person in a way as if he happened to be in an eye doctor's sort of like office or something like that, to look at these different elements that sort of like play with this idea about dimensionality in different ways etched on this glass surface, and including magnifying lenses that have been kind of inserted into that piece. So this is one example of the way how this idea of the precision oculist starts appearing in Duchamp's work. This is one of the Duchamp's rectified ready-mades, which is obviously a reward, so wanted poster that Duchamp found and modified. And he modified it by adding his own portraits right here in the poster. And I think it is a really interesting indication of the kind of like jigsaw puzzle-like plays that Duchamp was playing all his life, and basically that he was leaving for the afterlife, that it took until a couple of years ago for an art historian to discover the secret of this piece, which Duchamp never made it clear in his lifetime, even though he hinted at that idea. For what he did, he created these frames and the portraits in this piece into a kind of a retinal rivalry piece. So basically, if you copied that thing and cut it out and put it in a stereo viewer, just like the ones that I'm sort of like showing you, so you would actually see that these two pictures, the frames are three-dimensional, and his sideway and frontal views are merging with each other. So you get this highly paradoxical portrait of Duchamp, where these things are actually merging with each other. And Duchamp himself, so this is basically the thing. And it's really interesting, and it took so long after his death for anybody to find this secret out. And that basically means that Duchamp's work probably contains many more undiscovered secrets, in spite of that huge pile of Duchamp literature that his work has produced since his death. So, and where the tip could be found was Duchamp's cover for this book about his work by Robert Lebel, where he actually produced another similar kind of portrait of himself. So the way we should understand it is that this work is obviously a kind of a indexical pointer to the mystery of that earlier ready-made. So, and it took so long before anybody kind of got that idea what's actually hidden inside this piece, that it is another play with stereoscopic imaging that's part of that work. And now Duchamp also played with stereoscopy, linking it with so the idea about the illusion of depth with the idea about motion. And what is interesting when we look at the history of stereoscopy is that this idea is actually pretty much present from the beginning. So I will have no time to show you all the examples, but let me just mention that this original demonstration of stereoscopy was part of this physiology of vision that was also using demonstrations of moving images for similar purposes at the same time. So the idea of showing how the human brain basically functions actively in forming the picture of the outside world. So the fact that these two separate images are merged with each other in the human mind, or you would have all kinds of optical motion discs that did the same. So just a series of like animation pictures can produce a living picture, moving picture when you put them in motion. So all these ideas actually go back to the same origin. And that's why it is interesting that Duchamp got, as in his role as the precision oculist, got really interested in these ideas of creating images that are deep and that are also moving. And also here he was led away from the principle of this the two-eye vision, and actually to looking at ideas that could do it for just like a single eye. And this is of course his famous involvement with all these kinds of rotary discs in motion, like rotary demisphere, his film anemic cinema, and his set of rotorelief discs that he wanted to sell for the home, and that would have been played by with a normal gramophone turntable that everybody had. So the idea that failed, but that was a kind of a prophetic, because now people link it to the idea of device art and later idea where artists is creating mass-produced things for the home and not necessarily limited editions or unique things for the collectors only. There would be much to say about these early attempts to combine stereoscopy and motion, but I'm just going to, in the interest of time, show you briefly. This is an early example by the same Jules DeVos, whose graphical stereo view I already showed you. This is a device called bioscope that was created in the early times of stereoscopy, 1853. We only have a modern reproduction because all the copies have disappeared. We just have one of these original discs in a collection in Belgium. So basically how that works, I could explain it in a detail, but just to put it briefly, this works like the so-called phenakistoscope disc, So it has photographed images of an animation sequence, left eye around the perimeter of the disk and the right eye closer to the center, which feels kind of crazy. And there are little slits in the disk. So the idea is that you would be putting it spinning and you would look at it from the backside through those slits. Now, this obviously cannot form a stereoscopic picture in motion, doesn't it? Yes, it can, because the secret here are those little mirrors that I'm going to point out. So these mirrors are placed in a slightly different angle in relation to the disk. And when you look at this image in motion from the other side, through the slits, from the mirrors, those images move like this and actually produce a three-dimensional image in motion. There were other devices that tried to do these things as well, like Emil Reynaud's praxinoscope devices and so on. But I'm going to pass them here. But so this idea about Duchamp as an experimenter of ideas in 3D and also 4D, if we understand 4D as stereoscopic kind of a depth illusion plus motion, probably is the most sort of like complex example in the history of art of that particular kind of an involvement. But another artist whose career really spans the so is intimately linked with the idea about stereoscopy, 3D, 4D, and so on, is unfortunately very little known these days, and his work is very much worth introducing for you. And this is the Swiss-born artist Alfons Schilling, who was active for many, many years in New York, but eventually moved back to Europe and is still alive and lives in Vienna. Schilling was extremely active on this field in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And as he, in this poster, calls himself artist and a visual thinker, I think that is pretty much correct. So he was an artist who was constantly inventing new devices and new ways of vision. And I'm trying to give you here a very incomplete idea about how Schilling got involved in working with stereoscopy. One of the early forms of Schilling's art were these rotating canvases that he painted in the early 60s. So some of you may know about Damien Hirst's work in recent years using rotating motorized canvases. And it is such a shame that people are thinking that that is some kind of an innovation, which it is not at all. That is a 50 years old idea that Alfons Schilling took much, much further than Damien Hirst has achieved with that stuff. I think it's a rip-off, actually. And so Schilling, of course, was influenced by many others, by Pollock and action painting, and came up with his own ways of doing it with these rotating canvases, and you could actually control the speeds of these canvases as well as you were creating these pictures. This is actually a single rotation dispersion painting by Schilling shown in two positions. So look at it, it's the same painting, but it's just been kind of rotated a little bit differently. And what Schilling was interested in was actually not only using that device as a kind of a means of creation, but also as a possibility of display. So his rotation dispersion paintings were shown, depending on context, either as in static form or actually spinning in motion, and which I think already gets further than what Damien Hirst has been trying to do. As far as I see, he basically shows this static, those works. This is not about stereoscopy, of course, but it is about ideas about using motion, movement, image creation in interesting ways. But already in the 60s, his work, especially after he moved to the United States, became connected with ideas about stereoscopy. And he was probably the first artist who started experimenting with the idea about autostereogram paintings and the idea about random dot stereograms. This is an early example of an autostereograph painting from 1974. And if you know the principle, and so he was very much influenced, and he knew the inventor of the random dot stereogram, whose name was Bela Jules, who was active at the Bell Labs, and so then he actually got in touch with him and also with the Bell Labs and started researching these ideas further. So basically, if you know the system, this is basically the system you found on those Magic Eye pictures at the turn of the 90s and so. So there are those two dots at the top, and so the idea is that you are supposed to make those dots move and form one dot by your perception system. And then you actually start seeing that the painting is three-dimensional. So it is not just a two-dimensional plane, but it is stereoscopic deep field. That, don't know if you can do that. So it's easier for others than, not equally easy for everyone. This is another early stereoscopic drawing by Schilling about the same time. Works with the same idea. So if you can make those dots coincide, I can actually even see it in 3D from here, kind of, almost, but not quite, because I have to be facing it. And this is a random dot stereogram painting by him, where you're actually supposed to make these two pictures merge with each other and sort of like create that kind of a field. And he also was one of the first people to, as an artist, to start experimenting with this kind of special stereoscopic goggles, where you would combine these systems with a pair of video cameras that were sort of like, and you would actually be experimenting with the angles of the video cameras and then experiencing the view through that kind of, sort of like a kind of a media prosthesis. This is his early camera system with those picture screens that would be attached to that helmet. For this kind of stereoscopic experimentation. What's even more interesting is that he got interested in creating performances using 3D projection. This is a picture from an early 1970s Schilling stereo projection in New York. And the way how he did it was using two slide projectors side by side. And in front of these slide projectors, he would be having this kind of motorized shutter plates rotating. And those shutter plates, he had a large number of different ones. Depending on the speed and depending on the shape, they would actually make the three-dimensional pictures sort of like bent like plastic or some kind of like some kind of a liquid stuff and whatever. And he got really interested in this research, and he contacted the US authorities to patent this idea that came to be known as the Schilling effect. So the idea about creating stereoscopic illusions, manipulating them by means of rotating plates, that of course links interestingly with his early work with those rotating paintings in many ways. And this is a kind of a sketch in which he expresses that idea very, very clearly. To see with two eyes is equal to motion, spatial. spatial noise equals thickness of plane. So the idea about rotating things and two-eye vision combined. And but I mean that nothing is, there's very few things that are absolutely new when you start researching these things from a media archaeological point of view, which is the kind of approach that I represent. And for example, in the 1920s, there was a system called the Teleview, which was experienced in already some moving picture houses, where the idea was to show stereoscopic pictures that would be seen through this kind of special viewers that were attached to every seat. And inside there was a rotating shutter blade, and so which was basically like alternate between left and right eye views all the time. So this idea about like using rotating blades for stereoscopic vision had existed in culture earlier, even though like this system was not highly successful at all at the time. What is interesting is that Ken Jacobs, who is a well-known experimental filmmaker, started in the 60s and is still active, has been performing a lot in recent years with systems that he calls Ken Jacobs' nervous system or the nervous magic lantern, that basically use this idea about rotating shutters to create and manipulate either moving images in 3D or stereoscopic slides. And so Ken Jacobs' original inspiration came from Schilling's discoveries. Unfortunately, he has many years ago left out his name completely from his shows. He actually mentioned that many years ago in his writings that I am using Schilling's discoveries as a means of my own art. I think that Ken Jacobs is doing interesting stereoscopic experiments, but I'm highly disappointed with the fact that he has basically left out the fact that all his work was based on the discoveries made by Alfons Schilling. Who created the most amazing body of work with his so-called seeing machines. I don't know if you know these things, but these were artworks that were meant to explore radically vision. So they were wearable devices that consisted of different sets of lenses and mirrors and structures that either opened up the vision or narrowed it down. And with these devices, you would be basically walking both in cityscapes and in the nature, and sort of like exploring the different sort of like optical view on the landscape. And these things were not necessarily always about stereoscopy, but they were linking ideas together sort of like in highly original ways. This is a crazy looking device called light pump or phantom brain, which has this kind of a rotating motorized plate in front of your eyes, connected with this kind of like a lens system that modifies the experience of what you see while you are moving. This is his walking camera obscura in a canyon in Utah, demonstrated. So basically you are walking as a kind of a dark chamber, and this is a piece called Optical System, which is really interesting. So here the piece is installed permanently. So you have these two huge mirrors opposite the landscape, which is at a distance, and the pictures of the mirrors are captured by other systems of mirrors and lenses in that viewing device. So it makes it possible, by exaggerating the parallax difference by those two mirrors, makes it possible to view that scenery on the opposite side in a sort of like a really strange way, as a kind of miniature stereoscopic landscape. Like this. So Schilling's work is a great, largely undiscovered body of research and innovations in the world of vision. Luckily, much of that was recently bought by the MAK, the Museum of Angewandte Kunst, the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. So it is now preserved and sort of like will be shown. And I hope that his name will be wider known. I'll show you a couple of more things, and I try to be brief, knowing that the time is running. So we have a lot of work also from other artists who have sort of like used stereoscopy from time to time. One of them would be Andy Warhol, and his project about 3D shower curtains that was realized within the art and technology program at LACMA in 1970, where the idea was basically to use that kind of a plastic lenticular 3D technology that appeared in the 60s, you know, like in those kind of postcards that you can like hold like this and make a Jesus open and close one's eyes and that kind of stuff. So what Andy Warhol realized with this company was basically a large installation of these three-dimensional flowers and rain falling down in front of them into this sort of like a long wash tub, whatever. Realized together with a company named Today's Images from New York. And of course, I mean, Warhol was also interested in 3D movies, as he sponsored Paul Morrissey's Frankenstein 3D and other stuff at the same time. Salvador Dali, towards the end of his career, also created a series of stereoscopic paintings, which is probably a pretty kind of like a conservative effort, but where he was using his well-known mastery of illusionism. And so these paintings are supposed to be sort of like merged together in your eyes, and you actually get these amazing optical illusions that these things create. I'll just show you briefly. So there are more than I'm just showing here. So they are stereoscopic, extremely precise paintings that exist as pairs, like traditional stereoscopic slides, and merge into 3D spaces. This is more interesting. This is called Battle in the Clouds in 1979. And it's more interesting because here the color fields and actually the picture fields are different. So basically, just in the same way as Magritte did in the 1930s, you're supposed to kind of like use your optical vision system to kind of merge these together, which means that the color will change also as through that process. This is Christ of Gala, which is interesting because it's using this idea about the kind of dead Christ motif that's familiar already from the Renaissance times, but in a little bit different setting. In 1973, he compared stereoscopic vision as a sort of holy trinity of sight. Dali said that the right eye corresponds with the Father, the left eye with the Son, and the brain with the Holy Ghost, which is a kind of a strange way of like linking stereoscopy with certain kind of metaphysical Catholic worldview. But perhaps something about that can be found in this a little bit later painting as well. Another great artist who did work with stereoscopy is Jim Pomeroy, who was from San Francisco and unfortunately died in 1992. He did many exhibitions of modified stereoscopic photographs, where he basically added elements into stereoscopic pictures and tried to change their sort of like ideological positioning. And he also realized, he published work as sort of like custom-made Viewmaster reels, like in this particular set, which came with the viewer and with a set of 3 reels of stereoscopic photographs, and including pictures like these. So the origin at every case was an existing stereoscopic photograph that he kind of modified by those interventions in the visual field. He also did a great piece called Apollo Jest, which I'm not going to show you now because you can see it online. If you just Google Pomeroy and Apologist, and I recommend that you probably can find red and blue or red and green glasses, this kind of normal glasses, so you can see it in good 3D. So what that piece is all about, it is a kind of a highly ironic rethinking of these myths about the moon landing. So you know the story that maybe the US never actually made it there at all. Maybe they staged everything in a Hollywood movie studio, that kind of stuff. So here he is very, very cleverly using the ontology around 3D, because part of the ontology of the 3D is that it is somehow more truthful and more, you know, than other forms of imaging because of that three-dimensional illusion. And UC's found stereoscopic photographs and a narration as if to prove, I have the proof that this really took place. It's extremely funny. You will laugh like crazy when you watch it. So the whole thing can be seen on online. So it's like a 3D narrative with a funny narrative storyline, and then these crazy photographs that you can watch. What is extremely interesting, I just say this briefly in the interest of time, is that there was another sort of like wave of interest in stereoscopy by artists when digital photography made its breakthrough in the 80s and 90s, and I think that this is pretty kind of clear why that would happen, is that the digital photography really caused a crisis in this like ontological status of photography. So making people kind of like ask questions about where is the truth of photographic representation if everything can be manipulated and changed and modified. So, and as I mentioned before, stereoscopic photography had for many people not been just a sort of like a technology of illusion, but in a way certain kind of this kind of a technology of visual truth. So artists like Manuel, Ed Hill, and Susan Bloom started using it. So this is a very complex piece, I think, called Malevich in America, where this kind of typical Malevichian cross has been superimposed on a view of typical American forest, and asking questions about not just about the pictorial space, but this relationship between these traditions. And a very interesting example is Esther Parada's project called 234, these digital revisions in time and space, where she added a strong political component with to that idea. So taking basically, for example, so colonial representations of Latin American monuments in 3D, so found stereoscopic views like of this monument of Christopher Columbus from the Dominican Republic, and then basically by means of layering and modification starting to sort of like in a way deconstruct that ideology that is sort of like linked with that 3D space and that kind of like stereoscopic representation of power. And I think that what she did in this series is very interesting. So it's often a series of several pictures and continuous interventions by means of layering, which in a way causes a disturbance within that field of stereoscopy. So breaks down the illusion by visual means. For example, in this case, these Cuban pioneer figures appear on top of those earlier myths of like Columbus and the discovery of America and where the power lies in America and that kind of stuff. And I think that this is one possible way how artists' uses differ from the way how, for example, entertainment industry uses this for these great illusions. So there's a certain kind of a deconstruction of stereoscopy taking place. So she sometimes also showed these sort of like elements in this series, you could see some of the elements were shown in the exhibition, as well as the certain kind of gradual synthesis within that pictorial space. And I very much like this quotation from what she said about her motivation as an artist. Just as the two different angles of a stereographic image create the illusion of dimension optically, I hope that my strategy of juxtaposing my layering of distinct perspectives through digital technology will create a more complex or dimensional perception conceptually. So this move from purely optical to conceptual, I think makes all the difference. That's also like a critical artistic strategy. There would be another really interesting piece that I'm just passing on to you. So if you have never seen William Kentridge's animation Stereoscope, check it from YouTube. So it's there, the whole thing. And this is a very interesting piece because it is not exactly a stereoscopic picture and animation. It is not meant to be seen by these glasses, but it constantly plays with the idea of certain kind of stereoscopic divided field where the pictures are sometimes completely identical, but then they start changing and being modified, and there are scenes in which these separations between this left and right eye view is completely taken away. So it's just one like panoramic field of vision, and these principles are modified all through the animation. And I think that for an artist like Kentridge, who is highly aware of the history of these optical technologies and often links them, comments on them in his work, this work is a really interesting and complex example about the fact that artists, critical artists, can actually use stereoscopy. They can have a dialogue with stereoscopy without doing actually a three-dimensional view. So the 3D is an element of that, and you could actually twist your eyes and see some of the pictures in this animation in 3D if you want. But then the illusion is broken again in the interest of the narrative. And I think that this is also one way how artists can and should deal with these ideas. So if I've never seen this fantastic animation, so check that from YouTube. And there would be also interesting pieces of virtual reality in 3D. I'm just showing you this briefly. If you have never seen it, check it also from YouTube. This is a piece by French artist Maurice Benayon and composer Jean-Baptiste Barrière, who's been active with electronic music and at the IRCAM Center, Pierre Boulez's IRCAM Center in Paris. This piece, which was done in 1997, called The World's Skin, is a highly interesting use of kind of immersive space. This takes place in the so-called cave environment, which is completely immersive projection environment, where the idea is that the visitors are on a kind of a photo safari in the landscape of war. So by means of modified digital cameras, you are actually taking snapshots that basically remove parts of that world. And what's really interesting about this world is that it is not completely 3D, but all the media representations of war are through the like theater, kind of like a stage set, like 2D representations moving and placed within that world. And I think that here again, so we see an artist's take on these things. So it is not this. It would actually work against the depth of this piece by having fully rounded 3D figures there, like in a game environment there. So that is not the goal. On the other opposite, in the other, they go to the other direction, which means that actually letting them be artificial and sort of like cut out figures like you find from supermarkets or you find from print media or wherever, and put those things in a 3D space. And that adds a completely new ideological layer to that piece. And this is another example of how artists can do different things than this commercial industry using 3D for illusions. When you get out from that experience, you actually can take a print out of your interaction with you outside that cave space. This is something I've kept myself from 1998 when I did it and somewhere myself. So I have a few of those printouts that I took as snapshots in that world. So this was kind of like longer than I thought I would want to go. But so here are just a couple of tentative conclusions. So I think that there are many artists who refuse to accept stereoscopic 3D as a superficial technology for visual illusion. Rather, they explore and even explode the underpinnings of such illusions, both formally and conceptually. There are also artists who double as inventors and who have particular interest in combining 3D with motion, resulting in the idea about 4D, like from Duchamp to Schilling and beyond. And it's also important that artistic explorations of 3D are not necessarily realized to be experienced in 3D. A tension between 2D, 3D, and 4D is created. And this is just a reminder that reality is multidimensional, and so is perception. An artist obviously should be looking at extended perception, maybe beyond 4D, like Stephen Hawking says, maybe there are 11D, it's maybe 10D, 11D, and I don't know if artists can get that far, but I mean that it could definitely be a viable goal. This is the end of my talk. This is where I'm testing James Turrell's Celestial Vault at the Kijkduin near The Hague in Holland. Maybe there's a certain kind of funny link with that Dali painting I showed before. That's intentional. Thank you. Okay, so I hope it wasn't totally boring, this talk. I was planning to be shorter, but that's how life goes, you know. So, does anybody have any? Do you have any questions? I wanted to show you. Yeah. I show you I forgot to show you, but this is the cheesiest 3D thing I found for a long, long time. Have you seen this book, which is called Art Masterpieces in 3D? Which is basically like all the famous classical Renaissance paintings and whatever, turned into stereoscopic 3D pictures that you can see with this viewer. And this is really silly because these paintings were never meant to be seen with this binocular vision. As I explained, so the stereoscopic 3D in the Renaissance tradition is a one-eye enterprise, so two-dimensional thing. And so, of course, when you analyze these digitally, these paintings, and you take out the layers, so it becomes amazing kitsch. So you, in a way, of course, you destroy each and every painting like 100% or more. And so this is just the most ridiculous object that I've seen for a long, long time, which goes completely against these traditions of visual representation without being able to add anything else but kitsch. But it's kind of like a pretty fun to have, nice to have fun with this, you know. Like you are welcome to have a peek at these outstanding things. I had to pay $5. It's a bit much, but that's okay. I wouldn't have paid 10. Surely there are more artists than these artists. This was a selection. So these artists that I talked about, so I chose them because I think that their work is kind of interesting and challenging, and has sort of like added something to this discussion about stereoscopic 3D. Yes.
Sorry, if you have questions, can you use the microphone just so we're recording the lectures?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
In the 80s, since then, haven't they been working with the military with simulators, 3D, helmet-mounted, looks like a big insect head,
Yes.
with different screens for like helicopter pilots?
Yes. Oh yes. I mean that this is the whole field of head-mounted displays and that kind of things. So of course it's a huge field. It started in the mid '60s with Ivan Sutherland and in Utah, and then other companies. And those helmets were of course often seen as a kind of like a multi-purpose simulators. So you don't have to build the whole tank around or the whole cockpit. If you can simulate those with a kind of a helmet you put in your head, and so like synthetically simulate those conditions there. So that is definitely a technology. How well that's functioned and how successful that has been is quite another story. I just showed that one example of a kind of a helmet that Alfons Schilling did to show that artists were dealing with these things already very, very early on when so like much of that stuff was really on a prototype level within the military as well. There are also some artist experiments that have been made with helmets, stereoscopic helmets in 3D. For example, the well-known visual artist, painter, Matt Mullican, American artist. So he created a piece in the early 90s using one of those early virtual reality helmets where you could actually visit kind of like imaginary world or community that he had created with 3D computer graphics. And that kind of represented in colors and shapes and forms his personal mythology. So Matt Mullican created a kind of this kind of idiosyncratic world of his own meanings, and without giving the code for how to read that world to others. And he translated that to sculpture and paintings and many other forms, including performances in the state of hypnosis, that kind of stuff. And so one of the forms was a stereoscopic 3D world for head-mounted display. And I was lucky to be able to try that in France at Le Fresnoy, this art center when it opened in the beginning of the 90s, where that was shown for the first time. It was not very impressive because these helmets were very problematic as an interface. It's clumsy. It's also, they were very slow. Their calculation speeds were slow, so there's a kind of lag in the image. That's why I just, out of all this kind of work with certain kind of virtual reality and 3D, I just chose one example, which is this Maurice Benayoun's and Jean-Baptiste Barriere's world skin, because I think that here this idea that they decided to deal with these 2D elements within a 3D space made all the difference, both conceptually and also actually technically, because it made the world a little bit lighter at that point. So there was a little bit less data because you didn't have like full rounded figures like in certain kind of a game engine would have probably done, but you had that kind of like flat figures in that world. So I think that was interesting because it combined these both sides. But I think that in many cases really artists' interest hasn't been so much to create that kind of a total simulation environments like the U.S. Army has had, like this kind of like tank simulator in surroundings where like for practicing like a Iraq war, something like that, like they have. Artists' take is somewhere else, and sometimes artists can take this side of poor technology or the poverty or simplified technology, and that can be a pretty interesting and thought-provoking choice. If you see what I mean, but that is a huge field, definitely, and there is more artistic work as well. I could have added.
I'm taking a 3D modeling class at the moment, where we're learning how to 3D model the world, basically. And I was looking through the stereoscopic box you handed around earlier, and I noticed that the stuff that I'm making in 3D rendering looks more 2D than that box did. Like the graphic, like the foreground, middle ground, background graphicness of it is almost more perfected than a lot of the digital 3D modeling that we can do these days. I've noticed. How do you see like revisiting studies influencing 3D modeling and graphic design? Yeah.
So maybe I could just try to reply a little bit differently, and then let's see where we get. So what I think is, so if I go back for a while, quite far, like late 19th century, where so there were many books written about stereoscopy, and also some kind of world traveling sets. So which means like boxes of stereo cards in that looked like books that you were supposed to buy and keep in your bookshelf, and they made these. There were the companies selling these in the United States called Underwood and Keystone, and the idea was basically that they said was that this is so amazingly real that you don't actually really have to travel anywhere anymore. So you just basically sit in your study and you look at these cards, and the sets of cards came with maps and the guidebooks, about the sites, and it was really a virtual world traveling system, and these books, I have a couple of them that came with it. So they often contained these statements by like Harvard psychologists and people who were active in these great Ivy League universities, who basically said, we have examined these photographs and we state that this experience of viewing these photos is equals the experience of seeing these sites in real space. I mean, that there's no difference between representation and reality, signed by this whole list of paid guys, I believe. So, and it is pretty interesting to me. Of course, I mean that maybe this illusion needed this kind of authoritative kind of confirmation by these professors of psychology and perception studies and physiology, whatever. Because for me, I have quite a large collection of old stereo cards and viewers, and I'm fascinated by them. But I have always been fascinated by this artificial nature of that 3D space in stereoscopy. So the fact that, the stereoscopic, like photography, when you look at those pictures, like what I showed you, those few examples, for me it is interestingly the artificial, that spatial illusion, actually. So it is like a combination of this kind of 2D planes in a kind of volume, kind of like spatial volume there. So it is in a way not that far for me from this world skin, this thing that this world of war in kind of virtual reality in that sense. But I mean that if we think about this, and your question linked this more to also the idea about 3D rendering within synthetic computer spaces and things like that. So I guess that there is a certain this is just, let me say like a simple personal opinion, is that some of that sort of like 3D rendered spaces for me, and I want to hear again what you say, so like game spaces, like space in a some kind of like you know, driving games or first-person shooter games or whatever, they can feel more, I don't know, more three-dimensional for me, even though it's just on a screen when I see then some of the stereoscopic stuff. So because I see the stereoscopy in terms of that certain kind of strange artificiality that is part of its quality. It is not realistic at all, in my way of thinking, and that's why I kind of like the certain cheesiness of that. Just like Jim Pomeroy, I hope you really will look at that apologist thing that I refer to, that's 3D thing that's online. So that is part of the fascination. But I mean that, but I mean that many people are mixing stereoscopic 3D and 3D computer graphics together. But I think that they are pretty different in many ways. I mean, in their basics. So what do you think? I don't look at these things as a maker. I look at these things more like somebody collecting these and trying to kind of understand this historically and theoretically.
You obviously, I think you have a lot more to think about it than I did, but in reality, it's like, I agree, it does have a certain non-realness to it, or like artificial side to it that's sort of nice. I'm not really sure, but as a graphic designer, I'd like to see how I can have like stereoscopy influence my graphic design.
There's a pretty amazing stereoscopic advertising film for Sony, which is now creating a lot of buzz, which is called Realize Your Dreams or something like that. But if you type on YouTube like 3D Sony Dreams, you get that thing, and you get also making. It's heavily using 3D computer synthesis, but stereoscopy as well, and that is a pretty amazing piece. Have you heard about that? So there's a lot of discussion about that. It's also worth looking at making of, which is the full thing is on YouTube, as this, and also stereoscopic and monoscopic versions of this. It's a super ambitious promotional video for Sony. I'm trying to remember the name of that one, but I think it should come up if you like a 3D and Sony. I think Dreams was in the title. That's a good example of something that, for that kind of promotional purposes with a large budget, actually uses this pretty convincingly, out of very recent examples. Okay, let's take still Richard's question.
I have a pretty specific question about if you know if there are any connections between Duchamp's anemic cinema or his rotating pieces and the titles that Saul Bass did to Vertigo. Are there any like explicit connections there? Because superficially there are some similarities.
I have to say that I'm not sure. I don't actually really know. But he was talking about this anemic cinema, Duchamp's film, with this rotating three-dimensional discs. I was planning to show, but which produces very deep illusion that you can experience with one eye only, if you want, by just playing with this kind of aconcentric circles. my answer is, I don't know. Find out. But there were works by some other artists like Francis Picabia that actually had similarities with these Duchamp's explorations as well. But that was at the time, and those people knew each other. So this, of course, this relationship between these word puns that Duchamp was so interested in, and which are definitely shown on a very flat discs, and sort of like juxtaposed with these 3D illusions, is something that critics have been trying to figure out ever since. Of course, it's too simple just to say that he alternates between 2D and 4D. That's or 3D and 4D, whatever. 2D, 3D, 4D. But of course, that's one element. I think it goes further than that. Okay, so I guess let's finish. I think it's a long session, but hopefully you got something out of that. Thanks.